was in primary school, at about 8 years old, I had a teacher. Miss Jones was her name. And I think I was kind of in love with her. I would occasionally pick up flowers for her and force my dad to drive me so I could drop them at her house. She taught me English, and I passed it so well. Maybe if she had taught me mathematics, I would have passed it as well. I always knew I was different, but did not know what that meant. I never heard of anything about homosexuality. There were no LGBT role models that I could look up to or relate my experience to. One day, when I was about 11 years old, my family and I were watching a Queen Latifah film, and I told everyone that I liked her. And one of my 7 brothers said, "That girl is a lesbian. She's not normal." Without much thought, I said, "She's a very good actress. I don't see anything wrong with her." I had a very hard time that day because I defended Queen Latifah's alleged sexual preference. I knew, even at that young age, that there would be backlash if I ever came out as a lesbian, both to my family and society. I loved going to church, and I'd figured out a weird way to reconcile my sexuality and my religion. I decided I would be a non-practicing, God-fearing lesbian. It worked for a very short while. I was always comfortable with silence. I was one of those people that loved peace, and I avoided conflict at all costs. And I always assumed that someone out there was fighting for me. I loved going to church, and on this one Sunday, I was seated with my friend Helen. We had just finished praise and worship. We were all spirit-filled. And a very youthful pastor addressed the 200-plus congregation by saying, "There is a bill that the church needs to lend its support to." And I remember thinking, since when does church get to have a voice in lawmaking? And what is this bill that would need endorsement from church? Almost simultaneously, a group of ushers started to hand out sheets of paper, which I assumed were the contents of the bill. When I finally got my sheet of paper, I read the heading. It said, "Protect family values, support the anti-homosexuality bill." I felt a lot of fear when I saw this petition, because I thought, I have heard about this bill before. It's one of the most draconian bills that we had ever heard about. It had a death penalty clause for certain types of homosexual practices. It had life imprisonment sentences simply for being in a consenting same-sex adult relationship. It even went as far as prescribing a prison sentence for failing to report suspected homosexuals. While the whole bill was terrible, the last part was particularly worrying for me because I had presented a hypothetical situation to my mom, and I told her, "So what if one of your kids ever came out as gay or lesbian? What would you do?" And I remember her distinctly saying, "I'd rather have a drunken child than a gay child." As I sat in church, feeling so much fear, I wondered what had happened to the church that I grew up in. Church had always been a place where I found love and sanctuary. After all, the Bible says, "Come as you are." It doesn't say change yourself and then come to church. I also thought about all these LGBT people that came to church as a last resort when society had rejected them or when their families had rejected them. Even before the church service ended, I remember I walked out of the church with a petition in one hand and my friend Helen's hand in the other. You'd think then after my experience in church that I would be uncomfortable with my silence. In 2011, David Kato, one of the pioneers of the LGBT community in Uganda, was brutally murdered in his home. His only crime, that he was an openly gay man who had come out to be visible and fight for the LGBT community. When I heard the news, I had a lot of fear, but I also had anger. They had taken away one of us. They wanted us to go back into the closet where it is dark, lonely, and scary. But I also wondered, this is the country that I grew up in. This is the country where our neighbors were like our brothers and sisters. This is a country where we would sit and as kids and eat from one plate. What had happened to my country? Thinking about David and the work he had done, and with a need to ensure that his work wasn't in vain and that his legacy continues, I decided at that point that silence was no longer an option. Thank you.